Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea. Summer is not over yet, but it is drawing to a close, and so I am here to report to you about the summer metagame of Warcry in 2023. Kind of some interesting things. There have been fewer tournaments this summer than there were in the spring, and then we have lined up in the fall. I think a lot of people went and enjoyed themselves outside, and I love them for that. Of course, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, ignore everything I just said. There were a couple of tournaments in Chile, actually, and I wonder if maybe they were taking advantage of their winter months to get some playing in. But for the most part, my spring meta video was 4 months post an FAQ that was extremely impactful. In the 3 months since, that's, almost the same amount of time. We've almost doubled the amount of time, 75% more time, but only 30% more data. So that's what I mean by there's been fewer tournaments, but it's not like there's been zero tournaments. So we do have some stuff to talk about. And we have a lot of big tournaments and a lot of medium-sized ones too coming this fall between the Nova Open in just a couple weeks. Norway's having a tournament. There's going to be the Renegade Open. So hopefully a few pretty big tournaments in Minnesota. There's going to be a huge one in Warhammer Fest in Britain. There's going to be more in Spain, Hungary, Poland that I see lined up on BCP. So a lot is going to be around to look at in the fall. And so here's what we've got through the summer and what people are playing and how you can kind of look forward to your tournaments in the fall. Let's start with taking a look at the popular factions that are out there. We see I've sort of highlighted the sort of scary win rates, both positive and negative, and then you can see our fat middle is pretty healthy here. There's quite a few factions in there that are, populating the good side of the numbers. As far as the really high win rates that we're looking at, Demons of Nurgle, it's tough because I think that's really just the Chimera's win rate. I do think that Demons of Nurgle are really good, but I think they're more along the lines of like Soulblight, KO, Cities of Sigmar. Demons of Nurgle basically are Cities of Sigmar, except in Chaos, in terms of like what they're capable of doing. They're basically exactly the same as Dispossessed Dwarves. So I would say that their true win rate is much more along that, but then when you just add a Chimera to them, it gets very silly. Um, I don't know how sort of representative that is. I know some tournament organizers are starting to ban chimeras from their events. If you are a big Nurgle fan, I would try to find other ways to build with them other than the chimera just because you might not be able to play it at your favorite tournament. We need GW to do something about that monster. In the meantime, though, Demons of Nurgle, of course, sporting that 81% win rate. The Chi squared at 12.97 is extremely convinced that they are a problem. Very, very funny. KO are starting to really increase in popularity as people are starting to realize how to play them, as people are starting to decide that they would like to win. I've said on this show a few times that I think KO are the strongest faction in the game. I don't know if I still think it's like clearly number one. I think, people have convinced me with Horns of Hashut that they might be up there. But I think that they're just really, really remarkable. And of course, Cities of Sigmar are doing really, really well. This is mostly because people have given up playing um, humans and elves and things. I don't think there's a single like wanderers list in our whole data from this period. If you remember sort of the pre-FAQ, the first few tournaments of results that I had, Cities of Sigmar was around like 40% win rate. That's because everyone was trying their free guild and their wanderers and all of the unplayable things that are in there. But when you do the dwarves, they're really, really good. This is the year of the dwarf. Soulblight, that 60% win rate is so interesting. It's very, very high, way too high. Please nerf. However, it is down from 65% before that January FAQ. And the reason I think it's interesting is because the missions have actually gotten better for Soulblight. There's been a lot of Rumble Pack missions since the FAQ, but they tend to be kind of falling in their face a little bit in tournaments that aren't in the Rumble Pack, and so that's bringing their win rate down a little bit. Now it's still ridiculously high, and by quote unquote falling on their face, I don't mean, oh 03, oh 04, 1-3. I just mean sort of a lot of 2-2 performances in sort of more varied packs that are kind of bringing down the win rate a little bit. But at this point with 89 games, I feel comfortable saying that they aren't as ridiculous as they were before their resurrection abilities got nerfed, but they're still very, very scary. Ogre Moon tribes are continue to be just a very scary threat. I think that the win rate was sort of just below that 55% mark when I last talked about them, but now it's kind of crept up a little bit, and you know, I think that they're a really, really great choice for a wide variety of different types of tournaments for anyone who's really into those big chunky guys. Um, we have a really huge selection of sort of fat middle war bands, which I think is really great. Of course, Iron Jaws and Seraphon kind of really knocking on the door. Cruel Boys, of course, have a 54% win rate, but with only 26 games here, that could be a little wonky, right? They're only 2 games above 500. Um, I certainly wouldn't call them, out of bounds or sort of top of the meta. I would just say it's pretty promising. And if you like Cruel Boys, and I think there's a lot to like in Cruel Boys. If you like them, you should absolutely take them out for a spin because I think people are doing pretty well with them, and there's a lot to like about that faction. But it's maybe a little bit less clear than, say, Ironjaws or Seraphon, which have twice as many games under their belt and kind of roughly the same win rate. Now, it's still, only 5 games above 500, which is really good, but this is why I'm sort of calling them as being sort of pretty reasonable here. Uh, Wanted to take a look at some of the much lower win rates in Sylvaneth, Darko Savagers, Khorne Bloodbound, and Tzeentch Arcanites. Uh, some of these are tough, like Sylvaneth. I do think that there are, powerful things you can do there, but it is a little bit awkward. Like if you compare Sylvaneth with their 75-point netters to, you know, Spire Tyrants with their 65-point netters that are kind of just as scary in combat, uh, it becomes clear that Sylvaneth is working with a lot, but just not as much as what some of the other war bands are kind of similar war bands are working with. And then you have, the same thing with, say, Gloomspite Gits. They can get a netter for 55 points and one for 50. Um, and they're still sitting at a 49% win rate. That is even worse, actually. That Gloomspite Gits win rate is actually much, much worse than 49%. Of those 19 player entries into tournaments, 4 or 5 of them are just Peter Mercencabbage, who has got like an 80% win rate with Gloomspite Gits. And so everyone else is much, much lower. When about 20 of those 72 games are one person who's getting an 80% win rate, the rest are, and even he can't bring it up above 50%. That says something about sort of how everyone else is doing with the faction. What I would say about that is that Gloomspite Gits are incredibly powerful, but man, does it take a lot of practice. You can't just kind of trip, fall, and end up with a Gloomspite Gets success story. He's not the only person who's won with them, so it's not like it can't be done. It's not like, he's some sort of crazy yeti out in the wilderness that you'll never be able to understand. In a couple previous videos, I've showcased other Gloomspite Gets lists that have been able to do really well and win tournaments. So it can be done by sort of a wide variety of people, but it can't be done by just someone picking up the faction, playing it 3 times, and then saying, okay, let's go to the tournament. I think you're going to need to play this faction upwards of, 10 to 20 times before you're going to be able to sort of bring it to a tournament at full strength. Um, but back to sort of some of the others, Darko Savagers, I really think it's just that they have that trap. They have all those cool abilities where the cool abilities are unplayably bad, and what you really want to be doing with them is just kind of straightforward smash. And so people are kind of just building and playing them really wrong. Torn Bloodbound, you can make reasonably decent lists with them, but it's also very tempting to make really awful lists with them. They have a lot of leaders, most of which are pretty bad. Um, they have problems like, say, chaos, or sorry, their blood warriors have multiple builds, and not every build is good. The ones with the shields that don't actually function as shields, the shields, but they don't give you +1 toughness, they just give you fewer attacks. If you built your warband with a bunch of those, you're kind of out of luck because they're really, really bad. Things like that can happen. I don't think, man, 33% win rate is significantly lower than I would expect with them, but it is kind of an uphill battle for anyone who's not like really studying them and min-maxing them. And even then, I think you only have kind of a solid to medium warband on your hands. Tzeentch Arcanites just have this Carrick Acolyte problem. If you just could like electroshock therapy everyone who plays a Skyfire or a Carrick Acolyte and just get them out of here, I think that you'd see much better numbers for Tzeentch Arcanites, but we would never want to do that. People should get to play with their toys. It's just a shame that so many of the toys in Tzeentch Arcanites are just so, so bad. I do think Zangors are pretty medium. They're not amazing, so they're not like bringing the numbers up for Tzeentch, but you can do sort of medium warbands that are at least enough that you can sort of take them to a tournament, I think, with Tzeentch Arcanites. But no matter what, you're pretty much always going to be a little bit kind of going uphill. I think their leaders are all a little bit overcosted, things like that. So there's kind of a lot of tweaks that they could really use. They also really lack any kind of abilities that are worth playing other than the one that the Aviarch has. But that Aviarch, the meta for it really hasn't materialized. Now, for people who don't know what I mean, the Zangor Enlightened that are on discs, they have a leader who costs 275 points, who is really, really amazing at just blowing toughness 3 units off the board from a long way away, because he's got 10-inch move, 2-inch reach, so a 12-inch threat range, and then he has an ability called Guided by the Past that lets him put off potentially like 30 wounds at a time, but only against toughness 3. And he's a pretty good threat against toughness 4 too, but not nearly as scary. And so this is really, really amazing at certain jobs, like taking out support wizards that are toughness 3, 18 wounds, things like that, where you really would like to take them out in one hit, but it's usually really hard because there's a couple things, in the way. Well, this guy flies, so it doesn't matter. You can just drop down, kill it, kind of be outside of attacking range of the sort of chaff models who are body blocking, things like that. So just really, really amazing at one job. And the need for that job just hasn't materialized, especially with GW kind of nerfing a few of the really interesting triples that are out there. And so the kind of meta where Tzeentch Arcanites can have a really powerful leader and then some durable chaff just doesn't exist. And so there's even the more powerful builds of them aren't really well positioned in the meta, even though they kind of can be powerful, they can have reasonable applications. Now just isn't the time for them. Let's take a look at some of the unpopular factions because I think this dynamic is really interesting. I've always found it so fascinating that like Soulblight just continues to be the most popular faction in the game. I don't think that would be the case if it weren't at a 60% win rate, if it wasn't one of the most powerful, but it would still definitely be very popular. We see like Gloomspite being the second most popular faction. They can be a bit of a mystery too, especially given that there's only one person really succeeding with them. That's pretty interesting. And then you go to, say, I'm really fascinated by Jade Obelisk, which are down here, which are very, very popular in like the channel Off Meta Musings did a set of surveys and people voted for like what their favorite factions are, which ones they wanted to see him build some lists with. And Jade Obelisk crushed it every time. They got tons and tons of votes. People love them. But you see only 4 people have brought them to tournaments. There's really it's tough. 5 people before the FAQ brought them to tournaments, but even then, even combined, that's just really low. 9 player entries over, both pre and post FAQ is just incredibly low. I think it's partly, I've played a bunch of them actually, because I really, really like them. I love their kind of Mesoamerican flavor. They have this really fascinating mix of like, they have Mesoamerican design cues and they have like European warrior monk design cues at the same time, which I think is a really cool juxtaposition. I love Jade Obelisk. I could talk about them all the time. They're I did a ton of kit bashing on my sort of box of them so that I'm pretty happy with the results, but the regular box, if you just build it with the instructions, you get a whole bunch of the really bad fighters and not a lot of the good ones. And so that can be really frustrating to people. And so then the only folks bringing them to events are either folks who, they don't mind that uh, their warband is kind of half a warband, or it's the folks who really like doing all the kit bashing. And so those folks, you know, there's a few of them out there, right? There's a couple, but it's a little bit tougher to do. Um, One thing sort of competitively, I think we could probably put Nighthaunt in the other group. Uh, their popularity has really dropped off, mostly because of that. They're 4 and 17 people who do bring them to tournaments. They are really, really struggling, and it's all because of the resurrection nerf that was made to slow down Soulblight Gravelords, but just has not succeeded. And instead has just like completely dropped Nighthaunt off of the face of the earth. I think it's kind of sad. Stormcast is so interesting. So Stormcast Warrior Chamber probably does have enough games for me to put them in this sort of more popular, enough data to legitimately talk about them. But we have this Storm SCE unknown. This is people who play Stormcast at events and either the TO doesn't remember what chamber they're in because 3 of the 4 chambers all look the same, or it's because on BCP they don't have an option for saying which chamber you're in, and so people just put Stormcast and then never like submit their list, and then we never find out what chamber they were in. So my guess, if the rest of the stats are to be believed, Thunderstrike is about twice as popular as Warrior Chamber, and then of course nobody plays Sacrosanct or Vanguard. I'll get to that in a moment, but I would say if 13 of those games are Thunderstrike and the other 7 are Warrior Chamber, then we'd have enough data for Warrior Chamber. They are pretty playable. They're probably more popular than they show in these stats just because of that whole unknown thing. But they're pretty solid, I think. Anything with paladins is really good. Whether you're doing annihilators or warrior paladins, it's going to be pretty good in any tournament that's not like revolving around objective missions. Uh, Sacrosanct and Vanguard, I think they're less popular because one, they don't have paladins. Everyone loves those big chonkers, for the same reason that everybody in 40K loves Terminators, right? But the other reason being it can just be really awkward to list build with Vanguard. Their cheapest fighter is 145, other than the Gryph-hound, who they just made it so you don't want to play Gryph-hounds this edition. So it can be really tough with Vanguard. Sacrosanct you can build lists with, but those Sequitors at 120 points, they just don't do any damage. So you can have these kind of really chunky, hard to kill guys, but you're probably not winning games with them because they're not scoring that many points because, you know, they're 120 points each. And so even though they're incredibly tanky, there's just not a lot of places to actually use that. So I actually do think that you can do cool stuff in Sacrosanct, but it's hard to list build and it's awkward, and I think most people just don't want to try it. I'm also fascinated by Slaves to Darkness here. They were one of the most popular factions in the game last fall. For the first, 6 months of second edition, Slaves to Darkness were absolutely one of the top played factions, and they've completely dropped off in popularity, which is fascinating. My only theory, because they haven't been nerfed in any way, right? They're still pretty decent. They were going about 500 before the FAQ. They should be about 500 now. Um, but my theory is they have all these new sculpts, and none of the sculpts are in Warcry, and so that's what people are excited to play with. And since those new sculpts aren't in Warcry, they're just playing a different game. People who love Slaves to Darkness are just playing a different game right now, or playing them in AOS and then playing a different faction that they like in Warcry, something like that. And I think that's why, only four people have brought them to tournaments. That wouldn't explain why Lumineth have also dropped off a cliff. I think it's because the people who did play them, Lumineth, if you're not just spamming the two playable fighters, there's really not a lot there. I actually think I kind of like list building with Lumineth, but um, if you like horses or the sword guys or, the the weird ones like the kangaroo riders, those can be really awkward in Warcry, and so I think it's just the Lumineth fighters that people want to play aren't that satisfying, and so people are kind of staying away. Um, the people who are playing are doing fine, right? I mean, four people have brought them to tournaments. They're running about 500. Lumineth are fine, right? But they're just very awkward, and not everything is playable. And so I think that might be keeping people away. I don't actually know. Otherwise, there's zero players so far for Royal Beast players. I think that's too bad because I think they're really awesome. So as far as win rates that you see here, I wouldn't get too worried about these, right? For example, Stormcast, we know from Warrior Chamber, we know from Thunderstrike that Stormcast really are just tracking as being solid, right? So the fact that a CE unknown is running at a 60% win rate, I think that's just kind of a um, quirk of the stats and not something to worry about. It does mean that either Warrior Chamber or Thunderstrike should have a slightly better win rate than what they've shown so far, but maybe that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Hunters of Quan Chi have done very, very well in the Rumble Pack. Half of these entries, so four of these six entries are one person, but other people have also done well if they're playing them in the Rumble Pack, which is why they have this high win rate. I'll be interested to see if that win rate stays high. If second person plays them. um, Shout out to Off Meta Musings, which is the one person who plays hunters. Um, or if they move to sort of more competitive tournaments that are mixing around and not really only playing objective missions, if that'll change very much. I do think it's mostly just an artifact of really only one person playing this faction. Uh, People who have played Hunters of Huanchi without doing a bajillion conversions to get the one fighter who's good, those people have generally not had a great time, but there's way fewer of them. They aren't coming to tournaments, so that's why you don't see that reflected in the win rate. So, with all that said, let's take a look at the competitive tier list, right? Um, Now, I've sort of shifted a little bit from how it was before. And yes, some things have changed in the meta, but for the most part, you know, there haven't been anything drastic. And I think the reason is that it's becoming more clear, even as only just a little bit more data has been trickling in, that the top is kind of a little bit more stratified, I think, than we were kind of hoping before, right? There's a lot of factions and this whole B tier, right? All of these factions can, on any given day, with someone who has really put some time and some effort in to put a great build together of those factions, any of these can go and win a tournament sometimes. But as far as like, does that mean the game is really balanced? No, it doesn't. It means that tournaments are only 4 rounds. Um, and to be honest, at any given Warcry tournament, now this varies by region. Some regions, I don't want to say which ones because I don't want a bunch of people sort of talking about, hey, how can you say that about, our area that we're not a competitive area? But some regions, if you get a tournament with 20 players, three or four of them are bringing lists that are really tuned to the missions and are sort of playing to win. and 3 out of 4 of 20 is not very many. Other regions, if you have 20 players in that region or in a tournament, uh, like 10 of them will be bringing lists that, could potentially win a tournament that would be pretty competitive. And there's a pretty big difference in what floats to the top in those two environments. And there's other regions that are in between, of course. And the fact is, these top 9 factions really just tend to float to the top every time. Even Osiark Bone Reapers and Horns of Hashut, which tend not to get played as much, you do see when people do, really try with them, they can put some really scary stuff together. And I would say that these top 4 are still kind of head and shoulders above the others. Cities of Sigmar, I'd like to give them their own tier. I think just based on pure win rate alone, you have to give them their respect, right? They're running at like 62% with like a pretty reasonable number of games played as well. So you really have to respect them, but I don't think they're, at least personally, I don't think they're quite as sort of consistently scary as the other 4. Horns of Hashut, I put at the top here just because the things that a tuned Horns of Hashut warband are capable of, I think are more out of bounds than what other warbands are capable of. In terms of they can run a chimera if they want to, they can run a bunch of flamethrowers if they want to, they can kind of just mix and match for any sort of situation. I think Horns of Hashut are just as good with a Chimera as Nurgle Demons are. It's just that people haven't done it because people are wanting to play with the flamethrowers, and they're crushing it when they do play with the flamethrowers. One thing I forgot to mention with unpopular factions, if you look down here at Horns of Hashut, 16 games, they have won 13 of those 16 games, lost 2 of them, and drawn 1. So that is a low sample size, right? Let's not panic, but that is a significantly higher win rate even than Demons of Nurgle, who everyone has noticed is kind of way out of bounds. So Horns of Tristram are pretty crazy. And so, I've said on this show a few times that I think KO are the strongest faction in the game, even, the whole Chimera Nurgle thing notwithstanding. I still think KO are better than Demons of Nurgle, but I'm kind of starting to be convinced as people are starting to actually show what horns can do. I'm starting to kind of be convinced that horns are probably the scariest faction in the game. So, great news for everyone who loves bespoke war bands. Uh, but then this next group are they're just consistently showing that they do well. That even medium, one of the big things that separates this A tier group from everything in this B group is all these B tier factions, you really need to tune them to perfection to be able to really threaten at a tournament. You have to try really hard. You have to make really smart choices. You have to really know what you're going to be expecting. You need to maybe look at proven online lists and kind of iterate on those, things like that. With these ones, with ogres, Osiark Bone Reapers, Seraphon, and Ironjaws, you can kind of trip and fall and get something really solid. And so that's why I would put them above these B tier lists, is because they're just the in terms of structure, Seraphon IJ and Ogres are completely different warbands than these top 5, but they just continue to do well regardless of who's playing them, regardless of what the person playing them is focused on, right? You see all sorts of different lists of those varieties doing really well, and so they've definitely separated themselves from this other sort of big middle pile. Uh, we've also got a group here that's sort of calling casual play perfection. Very, very functional, cool, awesome warbands, but they're just like, you're not going to win a tournament with them, and that's okay, right? So just know that going in, right? That you're not going to win the tournament with these, but you can still put together something that's good enough that you'll have a great time and you'll feel like you're in every game. You're just not going to go 4-0 in those games, right? Uh, and that's a really good sign. Really, the only really what I would say like unplayable factions are these ones I put at the bottom. Claws of Karanak, Nighthaunt, SCE Vanguard, Daughters of Cain, Corvus Cabal, Cypher Lords, Idoneth Deepkin, my poor Corn Demons, and Quester Soulsworn. I would say Quester Soulsworn are probably the weakest faction in the game. These are all just like so awkward to build with that it can be like you have to really put effort in to put something together that's like fun in casual play. And you can do it, but then there's like a whole nother step to then like what could you do in a tournament? And I don't think even putting as much effort in as you possibly can that you can really like compete to go 3-1 at a large tournament with a lot of competitive players at it. So these are, pretty dreadful, but certainly something you can try if you're feeling ambitious and you're just like wanting to play down at the local game store. You can probably kind of feel free to min max these and you won't like blow people off the table pretty much in any situation. Um, I did want to say that most of these B tier, as I said, they all have lists that you can build that could win a tournament. I would never be surprised if someone told me that like you know, Slanesh Sybarites won Nova, I wouldn't be like, that's impossible. There's no possible way that that happened. Actually, I've seen the pack uh at Nova. I don't think it would be good for Sybarites, but you know what I mean, right? Like a different sort of pack. You could absolutely see Slanesh winning a really big tournament. Same with like Jade Obelisk. Same with any of these, you could see them winning. But you just need to put in so much more effort. And in a large tournament with sort of a lot of players who have put together pretty powerful lists, these factions do just tend to kind of fall backwards in the standings as the tournament progresses. And you'll see a couple of them do really well, but it just seems to be consistently just one notch below. So if you want to kind of show how great a list builder you are, show how great a player you are. I would say that this is probably the best group to play with if you really like to flex on people, because you will, if you do it right, if you do it perfectly, you will still be in it to win the tournament. But you won't really succeed if you don't flex really hard. So that can be the situation that people really love. I think a lot of people, you know, love the idea of having a chance to win, but needing to really show off to do it. And if that's you, I think this is really the tier to look at that I think you'll really love. Now, one of the things I think you might notice is a lot of the top factions are sort of defined by access to really cheap, useful chaff. So we're talking, all five of these top ones are all with really cheap chaff. And then Ogres uses their chaff a lot more than you would think, right? Noblars are secretly really good just by being really cheap. Um, and then, of course, OCR Bone Reapers are like that too. It's really just Seraphon and Ironjaws who are top quality factions because of their abilities, which makes them really fun. I actually really love playing Ironjaws, and I think a lot of people who play a lot of Warcry have gravitated to Seraphon as well because, just the ability synergy you create in those two warbands, there's just a lot of play there that you're not just smacking people over the head with your efficiency. Anyway, side thing there. Those can be really fun. Um, but a lot of the top factions are kind of defined by their chaff. And the reason for that is because you can always just pull in the elites that you want because of the allied system. So the sort of meta percentages, the win rates, the tier list, they kind of hide this whole second layer that's going on in the meta. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that and to show it here. So these are still really huge, right? But because you won't see it in kind of tournament results, you kind of have to go a level deeper to kind of know your options and know what to face. So I just wanted to make a kind of ally quick reference. Um, Order has probably the best support hero options of any Grand Alliance. People are using Quadrant Overlords, Cities of Sigmar, Foot Heroes, They have, Fight for Profit or Swift as the Wind, which are really good spells. And then those are on really surprisingly efficient bodies. Those dwarf bodies are just really, really solid. And then they also have a bunch of quality Stormcast Eternal options. So if you're in a faction with really good chaff, you can bring in a lot of sort of Stormcast wizards, whether it's Calthea Zandire, whether it's I've actually seen the uh, Knight Arcanum do some really good work with Stormcast. I think that the Knight Relictor could do really good work, but I haven't really seen it in tournaments, but I think it's possible. So things like that. And then you also have good wizards coming out of Lumineth and Seraphon too. So you just have a bajillion support hero options. And then sort of what I meant as far as here with scary combat monsters, Order has interesting options for that too. So they have a lot of dragons. So by dragon, I mean really scary monster that wants to be in combat, but is really fast. And they just like can fly around the board. Thundercats, which are evocator primes on Dracoline and Achillean Kings give really great mobility and really great combat prowess. The Achillean King is all about the burst damage, and the Thundercat is all about the sort of mobile durability combined with enough hitting power to be a threat. But really, you're talking about the durability there and the speed. And they also have a lot of slightly cheaper utility dragons, like the Bloodrack Medusa, which has a really cool disruption ability, or the Arch Revenant, or the Mizzen Master, which can put attack buffs in various places, things like that. What Order doesn't have is really big titans like Chaos and Destruction can do. Order doesn't really have anything like a FOMO Crusher, nothing like a Gut Lord. What they do have is sort of just kind of generically efficient combat fighters at lower points costs. So things like Stormcast Paladins, Kurnoth Hunters, Saurus Heroes. All of those are really excellent combat pieces, but they aren't like giant smashers. They're just really solid pieces that can legitimately do their job. Um, and so that's just a really interesting thing to just think about when you're planning out your order options, that you just need to know that you're not going to be able to just fight toe to toe with the strongest fighter in a chaos or a destruction force. And so you need to have a plan for that for any kind of mission that is going to be very brawl heavy. Chaos has a lot of support options, but none of them are that amazing. They're all just okay. Things like Sloppity Bile Piper, Chaos Sorcerer Lord, the True Blood from Splintered Fang. These all have pretty interesting doubles that I would be happy to include in a warband, but I would I would need to have a pretty solid plan for it because it's not like these are just like game-breaking doubles. The same is true. They have a lot of AoE buff and debuff triples, whether it's boosting strength or doing +1 attack or doing -1 attack on your opponent, things like that. These are all solid, but haven't made a huge splash in competitive play. I think because they're just not quite as busted, honestly, as just what Order can bring to the table as far as, the three sort of defining triples of Order of Swift as the Wind, Fight for Profit, and um, the Surgical Strike. I've played this ability a ton. I don't know what the name is, but why I don't know the name. It's Calthea Zandire's ability. Uh, Chaos doesn't have very many dragons, but that's fine because their best one is really good. Varan guards have kind of become the default ally for Chaos. They're very difficult to kill. They have great burst damage. They're kind of like if you put a Thundercat and an Achillean King and you just kind of mix them together. They're really, really impressive. But you've also got other options that are viable in certain situations. I already talked about how the AV Arc on Disc is really powerful, just the meta isn't in that right place for it right now. The same is true for the Pyrocaster. The Mindstealer Spheranx is actually really interesting in that sometimes you can get into a situation where it is netting the opponent's really big scary thing and then killing their chaff without having to fight it. And that can be really powerful. So you have a lot of options for speed in Chaos. Or sorry, you don't have a lot of options, but your four options that you do have are pretty solid. Um, And what Chaos does have is like infinite Titan options. So these are slow fighters that are still very expensive. And the reason they're so expensive is because man, do they pack a punch. So the Fomeroid Crusher is incredible. The Ogroid Myrmidon is really amazing. But even below that, they've still got a lot to like. And the really cool thing about list building with Chaos, they're my favorite Grand Alliance to list build in, is because every single points cost, there is an excellent combat foot slogger there. Whether it's the Poxbringer at 130, who is really amazing, or the Doombull at 280, who's really amazing. There is always a foot hero who is really good at fighting, who is available to you. And I think that's so cool about Chaos. I love playing them. Now let's talk about Death and Destruction. Death has some useful support heroes. They have Resurrections and Soulblight Gravelords and Nighthaunt. Those were nerfed a little bit, but that's okay. They're still kind of situationally useful. They have AOS, uh, AOE is what I mean. They have AOE buff and debuff and movement triples. Sort of the Flesh Eater Quartz movement triple is just as good as Swift as the Wind. I forget what it's called, but Vampire Lords and sort of Flesh Eater Quartz heroes are good for that. They only have one real dragon that you can ally in, and that's the Vargulf Courtier, but you should be prepared to see that in all sorts of death lists. It's sort of their answer to the Achillean King and the Varangard. I don't think it's quite as good as those, but death doesn't need it to be as good, and so it really, really fills a role that I think is nice. They have zero Titans. They have some really reasonable heroes at like a little over points cost. They're a little bit like Order in this way. They don't have anything like a FOMO Crusher or a Gut Lord, but they've got Askergan Exemplars, and you can give those a Divine Blessing to give them +1 attack, and then they really spew out damage. The only issue with the Exemplar is they can't really take the punishment in return, so sometimes you can kind of overextend with an Exemplar, kill something that's maybe not the most valuable, and then you're dead before you actually get to do anything else with it. So you just have to be really careful with how you use them. And then they also have like things like important arch regents, which are okay combat fighters for their points, but in general, their sort of choices are a little bit more limited for that. They have King Velmorn, maybe, who you could ally in. What you're really looking at with Death is how incredible all their chaff options are. And that's really what Death hangs its hat on. And so, you're going to be a lot less likely to see really, really elite, scary fighters in Death. But it's not impossible because that Vargulf Courtier does exist. Destruction has kind of the best options here. And so that's why I think Destruction Soup was such a popular thing for so long. For support heroes, they have really limited options, but they have the best one, which is the Brugit. That's the best support hero in the game, bar none. It's not even close. And then their other Gobblepalooza fighters are also pretty solid. They have very few dragons. Gloomspite Gitz really has the only good flyers, whether it's the Loon Boss on Squig or the Boingrot Bounder Boss. If you're desperate for flyers that are durable, because those Squig Riders are pretty fragile, they're still very good, they're just fragile. You could maybe play the Gnash Tooth, maybe play the Gruntaboss, but I would avoid them. Uh, and then they have really incredible Titans. Anything from, I put Titans, I meant Tyrants at 315 to Trogoths at 175. Just like Chaos, they just have the whole range. And all of them combo really well with Brugits. So if you want to just have an incredible, overwhelming amount of um, sort of burst damage followed by enough durability that you could credibly hope to get to do it again. Destruction is the way to do it, and they're certainly the best. They're by far the best faction at doing so. And there's something where if you're going to go to a tournament with the idea of winning said tournament, you need to be prepared for the sort of boom 25 damage situation that comes out of destruction. you need to be able to either sort of body block a mega boss or a gut lord that's coming in or a crusher that's coming in, or net it, or just not worry about it because let's say you're in death and your Vargulf courtier is hidden in a corner, and otherwise you have all these tiny people who just aren't that concerned if you lose one, things like that. You have a lot of options, but you need to be planning for it. And so hopefully these sort of quick reference guides help you kind of know what you want to prepare for and what people are playing. Just a couple things before we get out. The shifting meta. I just want to talk about how one thing that's been really clear as I sort of look at tournament results from one tournament to the next is that results from one tourney don't necessarily advise you for your next one. You need to look at what the sort of missions are going to be for your tourney and figure out what that looks like. And I'll show in a moment kind of an example of how you would change a build based on what the missions are, even among kind of the same cadre of fighters. Then we recently had White Dwarf 490, and it gave this really interesting list building tool that is a optional set of rules that will be in some tournaments, but not others. That is going to make meta tracking a little bit more complicated, but that's okay. Uh, where you can now pay to get little stat bonuses for your fighters. Some fighters really benefit from it. Like I said, the Aspergen Exemplar is really, really spicy when you pay to give it an additional attack. It, goes from 205 points for just like a solid offensive option to 230 points for just like overwhelming damage coming your way, which can be a really interesting sort of thing to do. Um, so, you know, from a competitive perspective, are they balanced? I don't think they are, but they are so interesting from like list building fun, and there's so many things you can do with it that I think it's really cool. And so, you know, I think it's very reasonable for a tournament organizer to come down on either side there because yes, they are not balanced, but for the large fat middle of the tournament, they're really, really interesting. And so I would expect about half of tournaments are going to be using these going forward. And so you should know whether or not that option is available to you and whether or not you want it to affect your list building. If you don't know, it's much easier to just build as if it's not available to you, and then you won't be heartbroken either way. But that's kind of up to you. And the last is when I put out my last meta video, Underworlds had only just become available. Now sort of available to use in tournaments. Now they are kind of everywhere. And so it's going to be important to know what your options are for Underworld fighters and what you might face going into any event. Uh, let's first talk about building for different pack types, though. I just wanted to use Corn as an example. Corn are, one of the worst factions in the game, as you saw from the stats, but they do have the sort of tools to build to any situation. And because they're weaker, if you fail to build to the pack, you will get blown off the field. And I think that's why their win rate is so low. But if you build to the pack really well, which you have the tools to do, I think you can still do okay with Corn. So if I was going into an all objective tournament, right, something with at least three of the four missions were objective missions where I just need to sort of outnumber my opponent, I would bring a Slaughter Priest to potentially pull fighters off of objectives. I would bring two Blood Warriors and nine Blood Reavers to just get to the objectives first, flood them, body block on them if I can. And then Blood Warriors are capable of killing chaff fighters in a couple tries, and so that can kind of be useful. But if I were going to a tournament that was like two objective missions and two kind of punch up missions, I would really want another reliable sort of punchy fighter in there, and I'd be willing to sacrifice three Blood Reavers to get it. So you could do something like double Korgorath if you also got rid of your Blood Warriors, but then you'd only have nine fighters. So you could do something like a Slaughter Priest, the Exalted Deathbringer. If you're allowed to bring Divine Blessings, you could add Savagery to it, which is just +1 crit, but the Deathbringer has quite a few attacks, so that can be nice. Um, and then, you would still have a lot of fighters. Here I've got 10 fighters for knowing that you are going to be playing two objective missions. Um, but just giving you an extra source of oomph there so that you've got a chance in some of those brawl missions as well. Then lastly, if I'm playing, again, we're still going with the Slaughter Priest, even though that's actually not my favorite. It's not my favorite Corn hero, but it is the one that everyone who plays Corn seems to gravitate to. Uh, so you could go with the Slaughter Priest, the Exalted Deathbringer. Then you could bring a Varengard, or if you want to stay Corn, the Juggerlord can do the Varengard's job just as well as the Varengard does it. Then you'd have a Korgorath and only two Blood Reavers. This is because sometimes, like in the core book, if you're not playing ley lines, you want to be able to move around the board, so you want at least one fast thing. But then otherwise, you just want really slow, really fighty elites. And the Korgorath does that. Um, Deathbringers can hold their own in that kind of situation. They can put a lot of damage onto even pretty fighty elites. And so this is how I would build Corn for kind of that more core book type of metagame. So you can see they can be built in every sort of different way, and we're even kind of playing a lot of the same fighters in each of these situations. So you could have a pretty small Corn force and still be able to kind of change them for each mission type. Um, and that's kind of what I mean here as far as taking a look at what you expect to face in a tournament and, tuning your warband for the situation. Last, I just want to give people a quick rundown of all of the Underworlds war bands that you can see in competitive play. And these are only about half of the Underworlds war bands that exist, but these are the ones that you might see in tournaments. So the first is Starblood Stalkers. They're the Seraphon one. I think they complement Stormcast really well. You can take a look at, you know, pause the video if you want, if you're interested in any particular one. One thing that I find really interesting is how some of these are in print and some of these are not. So, for example, Chaos has quite a few good Underworlds warbands that are kind of interesting and have competitive applications, but they're not in print, so you shouldn't expect to see them very much. For example, I think Spikeclaw's Swarm is really, really good, but you're just never going to see them because they were one of the very first. As sculpts, they're not as amazing as the two Skaven warbands that have come since. Whereas Death, all four of these are in print right now. The Exiled Dead, my local game store has three of them. The Crimson Court is everywhere. They just put it in the new starter box. The Crimson Court is not actually good, but they get played a lot, so I wanted to put it here. You should be aware of Call the Crimson Feast when you play against them. I would actually, because all four of the fighters from Crimson Court can do it, I would worry more about clearing the chaff around them and kind of ignoring them is how I would deal with a warband that's sort of running the Crimson Court. But you should at least like give their profiles a look if you're planning on going to a big tournament because they are popular. Almost every big tournament I've seen, and by big I mean like more than 20 players, almost all of them have had the Crimson Court in the tournament in some place, which is pretty wild. It's honestly mind blowing how popular the Crimson Court are. I don't understand it. Um, Sons of Elmorn are still in print, though they're getting a little hard to find, but they're still around. They're very good. And then the Sepulchral Guard just came back into print, actually. They were out of print for a really long time and now they're back. So all four of these are, you know, there's a really good chance you'll see them. And so that's really something to think about, both if you're playing Death and you want to think about whether you want to bring one of these to a tournament, or if you just know that there's a lot of Death players in your local meta, you should probably think about what you would do against any of these specific warbands. Destruction's kind of halfway in between. De Cunning Crew and Black Powder's Buccaneers are still in print, but Zarbag's Gits and Hrothgorn's Man-Trappers are not. The best single fighter in any of those Destruction ones is Prague. Prague is the king of Warcry. But the funny thing about Prague is Zarbag is so bad that you can really only play Prague in Gloomspite Gits. And as we've covered before, there's really only a couple people who can actually play Gloomspite Gits. I don't mean to laugh. It's just so funny to me how bad their win rate really is, given how many good players really love them and play them and have played them to success. Because man, everyone, if you're not a really experienced player, you really should like you should, I mean, play what you love, right? But man, you gotta really love Gloomspite to want to play them. Is all I would say. And you gotta be willing to practice them quite a bit because they're really, really hard to play. The other ones, like sort of the Buccaneers and the Man Trappers, I think they mostly really just exist to give ogres more chaff and better chaff. Ogres, like I said before, they kind of actually fit with the things like Horns of Hashut, things like Nurgle Demons. They're actually kind of closer to those warbands than it would seem, even though, they're big, giant, stompy ogres, but like an ogre warband with all of the really good chaff fighters that are in Black Power's Buccaneers and Hawthorne's Man Trappers, and then just some big ogres, has a lot more in common with, say, like Demons of Nurgle bringing two Fomo Crushers than it does with any other sort of warband. So that can be kind of a really interesting thing to think about. And it also means that, you should be aware that Ogremont tribes is not necessarily just like four big beefers who can never do anything on objectives. They have really, really good chaff and really clever chaff because of these Underworlds warbands. Um, Not going to obviously read all of these notes out loud to you, but I just wanted to put them here so that you can pause the video for your own reference to use these as much as you want. That is going to be it as far as covering the meta. Um, I am really excited to see where Warcry goes in the fall, partly because we're gonna have four war bands come out really soon. Maybe, hopefully one person will try to bring Royal Flaymasters to a tournament or Beast Flayers to a tournament at some point. But mostly I'm excited because there's just gonna be a lot more events in the fall that, we're all gonna be able to go to. I'm gonna be running an event on September 30th for anyone who's in the upper Midwest. And so, yeah, looking forward to kind of tabletop play ramping up a little bit as we all turn into hermits again after the beautiful summer weather is over. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.